So I'm going to speak to you about endings. I used to be a designer who done beginnings and usage periods, which I'm sure many of you are doing currently in your jobs. And then I started looking at the end as a place to do real work. This is meant to be on another slide at the moment, so I don't know why that's there. But because this is the middle of the presentation about ends. Hello? Okay, well, I'll carry on with my preamble while that gets sorted out. So that should be saying engineering at this point. So I used to design beginnings and middles, and now I just design endings. I got very interested in this. I dug in far, far deeper into how we witness and experience endings in our lives and our consumer experiences. And yeah, I went deep. I even wrote a book about endings, which wasn't easy because I'm really dyslexic. So that shows you how interested I was in it. So now I'm an obsessive and evangelist about this subject. So let's look at endings, and I call it engineering. Over history, across cultures, all around the world, we tell ourselves a story about a place beyond our life in death, which is about indulgence and consumption. So whether that is a place that you have silks and jewels or rivers of milk and honey or enormous feasts, what we're aspiring to in many of our cultures, and we've been told this story again and again, is a place of abundance and consumption that you deserve at the end. And now in many regions across the world, we're experiencing heaven on earth in terms of consumption and indulgence. Many of us experiencing and loving, actually, massive access to loads of stuff that we can buy. And we're really good at buying stuff, aren't we? But we're also worried about this, dying stuff, because we know we're over-extracting the world and its resources, and we're incredibly anxious about this happening. And so we're trapped between consumption at one end and the consequences of that at the other. But this problem really goes back far, far in history. So let's look at the consumer experience over that period. In a pre-industrial land, our relationship with waste was very different. It was far, far closer. The waste from the kitchen table would go to the animals. The waste from the animals would go onto the land. And the harvest and abundance from the land would come back to the kitchen table. It was emotional, meaningful experience of that circularity. What we tend to talk about at the moment is circularity of materials, not of experiences. And we need to re-engage with that emotional experience, because historically it was understandable, it was actionable, and it was meaningful to people of pre-industrial times. So we turned it into a linear narrative. Over centuries, we've been splitting this narrative beginning from end. We've accelerated the experience of onboarding and usage, telling ourselves more meaningful stories, giving ourselves better access to money so we can buy more stuff. And at the other end of that linear story, we've distanced the end as an experience. We told ourselves scientists with scientific equipment can do this, and we've removed ourselves from access to that place at the end. And what this has done for all of us is a small crack, a psychosis has opened up between your consumer self and your civil self. Your consumer self is really good at buying stuff, and I can order things, look at the right type of thing, like organize the financing, getting it delivered. All of these little niche things were really complicated. And at the same time, my civil self, that other part of me, is anxious about what that means to the world. On one side, on the consumer side, I'm inspired, that individualistic sort of encouragement to, you deserve it, this is part of your identity, buy more stuff. But on the other end, I'm sort of shamed into this altruistic behavior. So let's look at ends in digital. We're talking about digital today, and I think it's similar to many of the other aspects of consumer experiences. I talk about endings in physical, digital, and service sectors because the problem space is similar across all of them. Boom! It's the atom bomb, and that's where the internet started. So we started to stitch together computers in the Internet Project in the American military, because it's literally bomb-proof. We made a system that will stop the impact of an atomic bomb. That's how robust it is to get stuff off the internet. So that's pretty hard. And since then, we've been developing it, making it easier, more accessible. Putting stuff on the internet used to be cheap, really expensive rather. So you'd really consider, what am I going to put on the internet? And now we're down to a point where I'm going to take a picture of my lunch and put it on the internet. It's so cheap now. But the trouble with doing that and that amount of stuff is we've ended up with like just quantities of meaningless nonsense where we store stuff online. And so this I thought is Victor Meyer-Schoenberg in his book Delete, which is really interesting. The 3 seconds it takes to choose has become too expensive to use in terms of deleting things. But this has unraveled a deeper thing which is really important in our emotional and social development, which has been the ability to forget. When we were in small groupings in villages and towns, we could forget and forgive our neighbours. But when we can't forget anything now, because we've got so much stuff, we end up in this difficult place. This is a quote from George Louis Borges' book about a person called Thunes who couldn't forget anything. It says, since his accident, Thunes is condemned to see only the trees and never the forest. In the world of Thunes, there is nothing but particulars. And I think that's such a good description of the internet and social media. There is nothing but particulars. So what's the aim of engineering? If you look at the consumer life cycle, it can broadly be broken into 3 sections: onboarding, usage, and offboarding. And what we've done over centuries since the Industrial Revolution has been really good at narrowing and funneling consumers through a sequence of onboarding, different gates, and getting to the point of usage. And to do that, we've been telling them amazing stories and creating sophisticated brands that create an emotional, meaningful experience at these stages, the consumer life cycle. And what we've done at the end is just leave that into this sort of barren, emotionalist wasteland, which we've filled with legislation and chemical makeup of materials, and a lot of shaming as well. So this space has become this sort of end gap of meaningless. And because we haven't grappled with the end, we've really got to, we've lost so much capability in dealing with some of the biggest problems we have in consumerism. So making more meaningful emotional offboarding experiences, keeping the consumer and the provider together, means we can really pull back some of the problems and solve some of these problems around consumerism. And that helps us in digital ethics, it helps us with reverse logistics, and it helps us with circularity. When I go into businesses and talk to them about endings, one of the biggest problems that we have in businesses is this lack of vocabulary at the end. If you go into any business and ask them about their product, they have such a nuanced understanding about what the story is, what the target consumer is, what their need is, and how they use that product. And if you ask them about how it ends, it's incredible what a deficit we've got. And it's, I mean, on occasions it's laughable, but incredible sadness as well, I have from it. And what we're trying to do with it is build a better vocabulary so you can get those sort of muscles working, build up consideration, empathy, and context around the end of the consumer life cycle. Some of the tools that I develop around this is about working into definition. There's broadly 8 types of endings that happen in the consumer life cycle that the consumer experiences. And by understanding this and recognizing these, we can see insight into those behaviors, the characteristics of these, and then you can start designing, understanding, having more empathy. If you come into the workshop later, we're going to dig into some of these things. In addition, narrative, storytelling, Humans love storytelling. We've been telling stories for many millennia, long before the printed word was the primary way we communicated between generations. And we still love stories today, like films, books, games, amazing, profound stories. The consumer experience is often paralleled, at least onboarding and usage, is we're telling a story to the consumer about why they should buy this product. And we never tell the end of that story. It's the only human-made narrative structure that no one cares about the end. So we need to add in these powerful emotional sort of meanings around what the end of that story is. The end of stories is how it all ties together, how it adds meaning and purpose. So I wanted to dig into some more detailed aspects of the wider issue around endings, particularly in the sort of digital field. With this game, Peekaboo. We're not going to play Peekaboo now because I'm assuming you've all worked out object permanence when you were children. So that's what we tend to do when we're a parent. You sort of peek out from behind the blanket and then child laughs because they don't understand that you don't disappear when you go behind the blanket. So that you get taught this object permanence in a really young age. When you get to about 2 or 3, you start to understand identity attached to objects and ownership of objects. And when you get to 4 or 5, you understand that people can have ownership of similar type of objects. So you start to build up these very basic understanding of object permanence. And we've created versions of that and taken metaphors of the real world and started to build our early computers. The interfaces of our early computers were built on very fundamental principles. So the very first thing is that files go in folders. And then we build from that and we start to help people understand what a complicated database is. And with the files go in folders, we start to then go, and these folders are on my computer, and my computer is mine. So my folders and then my folders and files, etc. We start to build identity ownership of those things. This has started to change a lot in recent years with what we've been doing with clouds, and we've started to push these files onto other places, share ownership with companies like Dropbox, Adobe. And so not only these files' ownership and the identities of files, and the creativity ownership of those files starts to come into question. So when we look at endings and their visibility, we can see if I have a chair in my house and I want to get rid of that chair, it lingers there, reminding me all the time, its physicality, reminding me that it's there to get rid of. And some relationships we have, like subscription services, they pop up periodically in your bank account. So you'll go, I forgot I was paying for this still. So then you go in and start get rid of that. And some relationships, maybe membership club organizations, you can dig into settings and start to unravel those from there. But there's an emerging and growing amount of stuff which is over the horizon, beyond our visibility, which we're not grappling with in terms of these lingering assets. Another aspect of endings is a kill switch, I think, especially in the industrial sense, that we've created lots of machines over the last few centuries. And as these have got more complicated, we've needed to introduce different types of kill switches. Historically, in the Industrial Revolution, which was an absolute bloodbath, by the way, if you went into the Industrial Revolution and looked at the stats of people falling off machines into other machines and then getting chewed up into gearing and stuff like that, absolute bloodbath, like a war or something. So they started to introduce guardrails and kill switches. And a kill switch is like something you can hit really quick and immediately right next to the machine. So you feel empowered, it's really tangible, it's really clear. When we started to develop computers, which are essentially more complicated machines, we needed knowledge to shut them down. We couldn't just turn them off at the mains because that would have really ruined the machine, because you needed to have a certain protocol and a procedure to finish these things. So you had to have knowledge to shut the thing down properly. And as we've developed more sort of SaaS services, we've created contractual obligations and jurisdictions, so we have to follow particular laws in our contracts, and that's how we shut things down. But what concerns me more recently is how much more interpretation we're needing to understand what needs ending. I'm sure you remember the debacle of Facebook being interrogated in a grand jury, and more recently TikTok, where the people who were in charge were asking things like, how does Wi-Fi work? Or is Singapore in China? And so we have this really big threat, and I'm not particularly threatened by AI or big robots. What I'm really worried about is our capability to understand what needs ending and how do we do it. The ability for providing consensus is far more worrying than the machines that we use. And if we think about like how that models over time, we've moved our ability to have a kill switch of sorts further and further away from our ability into this level of interpretation and political splitting. Let's look at some examples of endings in different places and businesses and make them more tangible for you. The telecoms industry is one of the hardest nosed industries in terms of being able to leave. They're always celebrated as like doing really good retention tactics, and which I find hysterical, by the way, because if you do have a business and what you're doing is stopping people leaving your business, what does that say about your product? That the only reason people are using your product is because they can't leave your product. If you're a business leader and that's your psychosis, you've got a really big problem on your hand because you hate your product and you hate your users and you want to trap everyone. If you ran parties like that, you wouldn't have many friends after a while. You'd be trapping them in cupboards as they left. So what I find really interesting about 3 in Denmark is that they introduced a really easy ending. They had a couple of people in the company were interested in improving it. One of the things which they found was that they had brand values which said things like transparency, honesty, and you should look at your own ones and see how good that your ending holds up to those examples. So they introduced a really good ending to their product. Their senior management was actually worried when they were going to leave, when they launched it, that everyone was going to leave. Of course, that never, ever happens. And they've done really well. Another company I really like is Transparent Speaker. It's a beautiful product, really high quality. You can see through it, as you can see. But what I really love about it in terms of endings is I want to take it apart right now. I could buy it, and then literally, I just want to get a Phillips screwdriver and start undoing it, which isn't the thing that they want you to do, but it makes me feel good that I can do it, and I feel good about it. Fairphone, brilliant company. They have been encouraging us to look at the end of telephones and encouraging us to open up the phone, change the battery, improve the longevity of phones. And actually, many of them at Fairphone are engineers. They've done the training, the engineering course. But the last thing I want to talk about is, and return to, is the issue of death. These are gravestones from, I think, the Balkan states, and they represent on them, obviously people who've died, but they represent what they were buying at the time and what they felt was important to their lives. And I think the saddest thing is that in our lives, we align with brands and products, and that does to somewhat define who we are. We might, wear Nike trainers or On trainers or whatever trainers, and that might say something about us. But in death, it's the most undermining thing that you could ever do. So some of these people are in front of their Mercedes car, and it's made them look like a really not a great sort of taxi driver or something. Some are in front of their Audis, or like Susan really loved her iPhone 2, and that's how we like to remember her. But memorial is such an important part of human existence, our relationship with each other. This is Auguste Saint-Georges said, who was a sculptor and done lots of memorial, by the way. The aim of good memorials is to both commemorate greatness and tell complex stories. about how the great achieve their mythic status in the public imagination. This is a memorial in London. It's for all the women who died in the factories in the Second World War. And it's such a beautiful memorial because it shows the diversity of all of these people. It shows the collaboration that they had together working in those places. But it shows perfectly their absence within that role. It's beautiful, it's memorial, and it says something so deeply profound about how valuable endings can be in terms of building reflection, responsibility at the end of our lives. Thank you very much.